So now that we learned a lot about packages and how to import packages, values, types, variables, constants, how to get user input, and how to output content, as well as how to format text, and how we can perform calculations and use operators like the multiplication, plus, or division operators. Now that we learned all those things, it's time for the next important main Go feature you must know, and that would be functions. So what is a function? Well, we already have one here, this main function. And I sometimes like to call functions code-on-demand blocks. Because the idea behind a function like this main function is that you define some code which is only executed at the point of time where this function is called. Now, the main function is actually a special case, as you already learned, because the main function, of course, is invoked by Go when the Go program starts. But we see other examples for calling functions here, for example, where we call the print and scan functions that are exposed by the FMT package. So these also are functions, just not functions defined by us, instead functions already built into Go. But here we're calling functions on our own, and therefore then those functions do their thing and execute the code that has been defined for them. And you can actually see that code because in the official standard library documentation, if you take a look at a specific package, like this FMT package, you'll find a repository link in there, which you can click to be taken off the code repository of the Go language itself. Because all the code behind Go and the standard library is publicly available. And here in this repository, you can dive into the src folder to find subfolders for all these standard library packages, like the FMT package here. And you can then, of course, take a look at that code and, for example, there, take a look at the print.go file. And in here, you'll find all the code that is related to printing, so to outputting and working with text. And in there, in this file, you will, for example, if you search for it, find the printf function. Here it is. And that is now Go code for defining a function that can be executed to perform a certain task. And it can, by the way, be interesting to explore the official Go code to get ideas and inspiration on how you could write your own code, and of course also to understand how some of these built-in functions work. But that's the idea behind functions. It's code on demand which is only executed when the function is called, which in case of the main function is the case immediately when the app starts, but which in case of print and scan, for example, only happens when you call these functions. Now, of course, as a Go developer, you're not limited to using built-in functions like print and scan or defining this special main function. Instead, you can also build additional functions. And typically, that's done below the main function here, so that you can, for example, create a new function by using the func keyword. That is how you do define a new function, with help of that func keyword. And then you can give this function any name of your choice. Now, let's say here we want to create a utility function that wraps this code. Now, we can argue how useful such a function actually is, but for practice purposes, we can build it. So we could build our own function that could be called print or maybe output text, something like this. So that's how you give your function a name. And then when defining a function, after the function name, you have to add a pair of parentheses, which can be used to define any input parameters this function should take. And I'll get back to this in just a second. Then after these parentheses, you add curly braces, opening and closing. With this, you create the so-called function body. So between those curly braces, you put the code that should be executed when this function is called. Now, since this should be a utility function for outputting text, we could use the format package in there to call print, like this. So that's how we define a function, that's how we call a function. And therefore this basic first function here is simply a wrapper, you could say, around the print function exposed by the FMT package. But of course, at the moment, this function isn't actually too useful. Now, to be more useful, this function here should accept some input arguments, or at least one input argument. So one input value that has to be passed into this function from the place where the function will be called in the future. And to accept such an input argument, you go to these parentheses and then simply add any name of your choice, like for example text. That's now the name of the parameter this function expects. Now, when adding parameters to functions, you also always must give them a value type by simply adding the type after the parameter name, like string here. And of course here you could accept any type of value you want, but here it's a string. You can also accept multiple parameters, for example a second text, by separating them with a comma here. And you can add as many as your function needs. Now, if your parameters happen to be of the same type, you can also shorten this notation and just have your parameter names here, and then thereafter the type of the values that should be accepted for these parameters. When using this notation, all parameters must accept the same type though. If you add the type after each parameter, you can instead also accept mixed types. And you can also go for this notation if you want to be very clear about which parameter receives which type. Here, however, I only need one parameter, so I'll get rid of the second one. And now you can use these parameters inside of this function body and only there, like any other constant or variable. So if you want to output the value stored in text, so the value received on that text parameter, you can simply use it like this here. And with that, we can now use our custom function in all the places where we want to output text, a single piece of text to be precise, because we only accept one text parameter. So I, for example, at the moment can't use it here, because here I actually want to output two pieces of text. We could of course accept two parameters, but here I just want to accept one, so therefore we can use it, for example, for those outputs here, for those print statements. So instead of using FMT print here, we can use our own custom output text function and then pass the text that should be output as an argument here. And as you can see, if I don't provide a value for this argument, I actually do get an error that I'm not passing in enough arguments to output text, that I pass none, but it actually wants one, which is of type string. So these error messages are really helpful, of course, and help you find and fix errors quickly. So therefore here, I will add this text, and we can now repeat this here, where we also output expected return rate, and then also here, to output this year's text. And that's how we can define and also use a custom function.